Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. Our guest for this episode is Dr. Paul Zak, who is a professor at Claremont Graduate University and is in the top 0.3% of the most cited scientists in the world. Paul's 2 decades of research have taken him from the Pentagon to Fortune 50 boardrooms to the rainforest of Papua New Guinea. In this episode, we focus on the foundational aspects of persuasion. We will explore ethical considerations in persuasive communication, discuss the most effective communication styles for influencing others, and present a proven formula to make your communication more persuasive. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Welcome to the program, Dr. Zak.
Thank you, Paul. It's great, Charles.
What I find a lot of times is that we're using old tactics to try to persuade people. Having spent 2 decades, helping leaders and organizations embrace changes that they'd rather fight or ignore, changing the minds of individuals, especially stubborn individuals, is still possible, but we're not using conventional wisdom to do so. We're still relying on outdated methods and tactics. And talk to me a little bit more about that, if you agree, and then how we can kind of bring our understanding up to the current day.
So behavior change is hard, and it's hard because the brain's a very lazy organ. And by that, I mean, it's very efficient for the brain to establish default pathways in the brain that manifest as habits. And to change those requires a big metabolic investment. So to save energy, this quote, lazy organ, means that we do the same thing over and over and over. And so from an organizational transformation or coaching perspective, we've got to somehow convince that organism that investing that metabolic energy into establishing new pathways and behaviors is effective. So how do we do that? So what we found in this decade and a half of research funded by the DoD and others is that you've got to convince that brain, that person, that the payoff from this change in behavior is sufficiently valuable. So by trying to understand how to persuade people, we incidentally identified how the brain values social emotional experiences. So the brain modulates its energy flow by saying, hey, what Charles is saying doesn't seem that very interesting to me or that valuable to me. I'm just going to kind of flush it out, just like the breakfast I had 2 Wednesdays ago. I'm not going to put any processing power into remembering that. But conversely, if you can convince me that the value of this experience is sufficiently high, and that value is the metric of that is this neurologic state I've called immersion, then my brain goes, oh, holy crap, Charles, that's the most exciting stuff I've ever heard. I should invest the processing power to really fully understand this.
Wonderful. And we'll talk more about immersion here shortly. Persuasion can change your preferences when you target persuasion in a physiological and psychologically open way, right? They have to be willing and open to change, whether or not they know about this or not, or feel this way. And when influence is focused on something that's of interest to them.
Right. So establishing that precondition is the first thing, and we call that psychological safety. So we developed a physiologic measure of that. How comfortable am I? If I'm tired or hungry or my feet hurt, or if I'm not comfortable around you or you seem scary, then I'm burning all kinds of neural bandwidth going, what the hell's going on here? How do I get myself out of this situation? So the first thing is, we always try to be so efficient, Charles. Are like, okay, let's do this thing. We got half an hour. Settle down, take a breath, have a sip of water like you just did, and relax a little bit. And so I'm opening up space in the brain for an immersive experience.
Let's look at some of the ethics around persuasion, because that always gets talked about with persuasion as well.
As you know, a whole chapter in the book on the ethics of persuasion. So first of all, as social creatures, that's exactly what we do all the time. So I've been married for 28 years. I'm still nice to my wife, at least most of the time. And I'm trying to persuade her to stay married to me and not be a jerk. Anything. If I'm a jerk to my friends, they don't want to be around me. But if I'm nice to them, then I have the ability to influence them, right? So first cut is social creatures always influence each other. Ants, bees, humans, that's what we do. Now, if that influence is done in a way that's transparent, in which you have an opportunity to say yes or no to what I'm saying, and you're not coerced in any way, you're not under time pressure, then you can evaluate what I'm telling you and make an informed decision. Then it's ethical to try to influence other people. Um, if those conditions are not met, one or more of those conditions are not met, then I'm using kind of undue influence, and that's not right. So in the kind of nudging world, you kind of hide. I'm going to make the plate small so people don't gain as much weight. It seems like it's okay, except what if I'm diabetic and I really need to get some sugar on board now? So literally, I remember being as an undergraduate in a library, a guy who was diabetic, gave himself insulin, and it was some issue of some book he wanted to check out. And he's like, I need to get food now, like right now. I'm going to go into a coma if I don't get food. And they're like, no, you can't leave. It's like, no, you don't understand. This is a medical issue. Like, so that's, this kind of hidden issue. So I think we want to be super transparent. So if I'm being coached, if I'm engaging with a professional organization to help us transform what we're doing, particularly how we organize the humans, let's be super clear on that and allow people to opt in or opt out. So-called libertarian paternalism means, hey, on average, here's the best thing that we've all decided is good to do: have smaller plates so you don't get fat when you're a freshman eating at the dining halls. But if it's transparent and you can't say no, then you're saying the means justify the end. And now we're in a slippery slope. So I think from a professional setting, in a business setting, we want to be very clear. If I'm selling you something, Charles, I'm the salesperson. I'm trying to convince you. I'm trying to influence you to buy my thing. But if I'm trying to lead an organization and I'm using hidden techniques to try to influence your behavior, often that will come out in the wash. Someone will find a memo. Everyone's got these little cameras in their pockets. And so I'd rather just be transparent about it and allow people to opt in or opt out.
When you have a great test to assess if a persuasive communication is ethical, and that's the TARES test, TARES. If you could unpack that for our listeners.
Yeah, I've actually forgotten what that acronym is, but it basically says you've got to be transparent about it. You've got to be clear about what the goals are. And then it gives you this sort of analytical approach to say, hey, is this actually something I should be doing?
Yep. It's truthfulness, authenticity, respect, equity, and social responsibility. I love that. So we'll put that in the show notes for those that want to have that. But that's a nice test just to have in your back pocket to make sure that what you're trying to influence or persuade is done in an ethical manner. The foundation of which is psychological safety, right? We only really connect with people if we feel safe and if they're trustworthy.
Right. So I'm more able to influence someone who views me as trustworthy, views me as a fair dealer. And for most of us, it means I have history, right? So if I want to be perceived as someone you can trust, then I need to be trustworthy. We found physiologically is that we look at the underlying neural substrates that reflect trust. Women are better able to do this than men. So in particular, they release more of this neurochemical oxytocin, which is a signal of trust between individuals, unconscious signal, of course. In every experiment we've run in 20 years, that's true. So again, there's a big distribution. Doesn't mean men can't do this, but again, generally when we look at persuasion by men, it tends to be more aggressive, faster, doesn't have that time to kind of build up the relationship where, again, on average, women tend to be better at building those relationships, spending a little more time. And data, for example, on in the same industry, women tend to sell more, meet their sales goals more effectively than men do because they're kind of building that social relationship. The first thing is just get to know this person, right? Even if they're someone you've worked with for years, how well do you know them? So the building up of social ties is an important component to influence.
Wonderful. So when we share each other's emotional states, neural activity synchronizes. This not only happens for immersion, but also for psychological safety. And another big takeaway that I took from your work regarding this influence and persuasion is look at another person's personality type. And you list the acronym OCEAN for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And you state that persuasive messages that target the right personality type are so much more effective than those that don't even take that into account.
Exactly right. So these different personality types are interested in different things and tend to speak using different words, kind of use a different language, if you will. So if you can parse their personality type, then you can speak to that kind of personality. You can speak their language, if you will. So, for example, people who are much more social, they care about social factors. So if I want to convince you to take your vitamins when you get up in the morning and talk about how much your family depends on you, how it's important not only for your health, but for everyone around you, right? If someone who's much more analytical and you think about, hey, these are why vitamins are shown in the scientific literature to extend your life and make you function better and make you prettier and smarter and whatever I'm going to say, right? So I'm just going to use different kind of language. So really think about that individual and make it more digestible for them. And again, you have this high bar, which is my brain just wants to do what it's doing because it's worked for me for the past 35, 50, whatever, how many years. And so I've got to break through that by making it as easy as possible. So think this as reducing friction, easy as possible for you to agree with me if you want to.
Well, persuasion requires sufficient immersion too in a message to provoke that action. And we talked about this on a previous episode. It's a neurologic state by two neurochemicals, oxytocin and dopamine, that really is that kind of that value mechanism for social and emotional experiences. If you could unpack that a little bit more for our listeners and how it really relates to having people take action and be more influenced by a message.
Right. So once I've established psychological safety, I want to convey the information in a way that the receiver's brain goes, this is very valuable to me. So that value mechanism, as you said, is immersion, which is a 1 second frequency set of electrical signals coming off the nervous system that we can measure. And so when we looked at different ways to convey information and measure their immersion and their impact on behavior, we have found that the most effective way to induce high levels of immersion is to tell a story, right? So a story has characters in a setting with some kind of crisis or something they have to resolve. Those characters will display authentic emotions and then in some way resolve that crisis. So, there's no shortage of movies using a narrative arc. There's no shortage of novels. We as social creatures are fascinated by what the other humans are doing, whether they're nonfiction real humans or fictional humans. And so if you can craft that information in story terms, even if it's technical and analytical, then our brains are naturally going to be more immersed and therefore more influenced by it. So, as you know, Charles, all the major professional services organizations, the Accentures, the EYs, PwCs, train their analysts to tell stories, right? And these again may be an analytically based story, but they're going to start out with, here's one of your customers, you the client, here's one of your customers who stop using your services, and let me tell you why. And then they'll have some charts and some graphs, and right, and that's fine. But I want to start with that human scale story if I want to convince you in a way that affects your behavior.
So start the persuasive message with a hot open to capture that dopamine surge in attention, but not too aggressively to degrade the psychological safety piece, causing the message to fall maybe on deaf ears. So an effective persuader, right, it's going to ask to, target that persuasion and for the person to take action during maybe a peak immersion moment, which they're more likely to act upon it.
Exactly right. So the necessary condition to influence your behavior is, I got to get you to attend to this, right? So attention is conscious attention is 0, 1 variables. To get to attend, then I got to get you to care about this, and that's an emotional response. So that storytelling with emotions, which, as you said earlier, those emotional responses are contagious among social creatures. If I'm excited about this, then generally you'll get excited about it if I can structure it well enough. So really kind of think of these 3 dimensions that the storyteller or the persuader can control that influence whether you are going to change your behavior. So one of those is establishing psychological safety. The second one is the way I structure that content, right? So structure in terms of a story. The third is the way I deliver it, right? So I can have an amazing story, but if I speak in a monotone, that just says I don't care about it as the speaker, and therefore your brain goes, oh, well, this guy doesn't care about this thing. So really kind of think of those 3 dimensions. And then you said something really important, which is if there's an ask, a behavioral ask, if you can make that ask at a peak immersion moment, a moment of high immersion, high emotionality, then the brain is much more likely to go, oh yeah, I should do this thing, because now we're in some sense, the same emotional level, right? Immersion is contagious. I'm like, oh my God, this is the most important thing ever. I've got to sign up for a 401k, or I've got to do whatever this thing is.
Love it. And you have this as an acronym, the SIRTA process, to achieve this immersive storytelling. We kind of touched upon the first two: staging, establish that psychological safety prior to the message, as a precondition for influence. The immersion piece, craft that message so people's brains identify it as valuable. And then the next one we haven't touched upon quite yet, so maybe you could unpack a little bit more, is relevance. Determine the amount of neural processing really that's devoted to the message.
Right. So there's not one perfect persuasive pitch, story, communication for everybody. It's got to be relevant for that speaker. So really think about what that person cares about the most. Part of that relevance, as we talked about earlier, is lining up with their personality type. So it's easy for them to process that information. But if you're going to try to sell me diapers, I don't have infants at home, I'm just not relevant to me. It may be a heck of a great story, sales pitch, just not relevant to me. So really, you've got to know that customer or know that colleague. What do they care about? And again, we're back to social connection now. If I know more about you as an individual, then I can craft that narrative so that it's easy for you to understand it and it's meaningful to you. So we see in the brain is that when something is relevant to us, we actually apply more processing power to that experience because it's could affect our lives, is meaningful to us.
Well, the next one is the T, the target. Identify people who will love the message because the likelihood of persuasion is increased by identifying what you call superfans.
Right. So people who are just over the moon excited about this. So again, you can see them behaviorally, but we also can see them neurologically. And oftentimes the neurologic superfans for an experience who are going to not only act on it, but share it. Right. Think of how powerful word of mouth is. So think of the org transformation space. If I can find those super fans who are like, hey, we're doing this new thing, we're going to organize ourselves in a different way, those super fans can then influence the other colleagues around them so that they follow up on this. So if you can find them again, behaviorally, neurologically, and then just ask them for help. If you are leading this organization or leading this sales team, get those super fans to work for you because they begin to identify themselves with this new thing and they want to be part of it. So as you know, Charles, all the major movie studios have fandom departments. They actively engage these fans to spread the word about the content they're producing. So we should do the same thing as leaders. We should find those super fans and ask them to be our emissaries, and they love doing it. They'll do it right away.
How do you convert people into superfans? Perhaps people that are more judgmental or not on that same path. Is there a process, a way that you can build that group?
Yeah, part of it is, bringing social pressure. So, we are social creatures, and we have found literally every study we've done, so many studies that if I bring in this social layer, I'm much more likely to have a high immersion moment to have influence. So I'm a university professor. When I teach, they always say, do you want to teach hybrid or remote? Like, no, I'm going to be there in person. I want it to be fabulous. So from a leadership perspective, it's really important when you run teams that are diverse in location and time zones that you see them. You've got to actually make the time to see them in person. It's so much more powerful. And then bring people together. And now we're all on the same page and we're reinforcing each other. So again, that emotionality, that immersion will flow between all those people in that group.
Well, that's a great insight because I see that a lot, even in our business and other businesses. When you can bring customers together, they can sell your story if they're fans much better than you, and it's not coming from a biased perspective. So it's a great way to have that social proof, which is so important for influence.
Yeah, and give them some little thank you. Give them some little tchotchke. I'm looking for props now. Like, hey, I know you love these things, or a coffee card or something. And like, we're so happy you're a super fan. So, yeah, in my software company, when people refer us, I always send them a thank you. I mean, just something physical, some swag, something like that. Like, I need those super fans. They do so much work for us, and they're so happy to be recognized. Yeah, it takes so little.
And people do business with people they know, like, and trust. So building that connection, building that kindness, letting them know that they're important to you is so critical for that to develop that connection and build that influence that really kind of transcends from their experiences to others.
Absolutely. And I love that you use the word kindness. I think, we're here to serve others and we want to resolve whatever pain or problem they have. And when we do that well and we do that with joy and kindness, like, hey, I love working with Charles. He's awesome. Yeah, I would not say no to have another meeting with you. And also really think, at least for us, we think really about other pains we can solve for you. So if you already seem to like me, you like our product. Let's talk about other use cases and at least have that conversation. So I think sometimes in the sales world, so happy to make a sale, like, oh God, I made a sale, I'm so relaxed. But then really, in the sort of customer success world, think about proactively suggesting other ways these people who really do use your product a lot can get value from it.
Well, especially in the sales world, it's not so much that you have the best solution, but you understand their needs more than anyone else, and you tell a more compelling story. It's really about identifying their pain points.
Yeah, selling is all much more about listening than it is talking. If you're a great listener, then you can craft, again, a relevant conversation about something this person cares about. If you can do that in terms of a story, hey, Charles, I had a customer just like you. He had the same kind of issues. Let me tell you what he did. We understand that, as opposed to here's a stack of specs for you to look at. No one wants to do it. Even engineers don't really want to do that. I want to be engaged by, oh yeah, this dude had the same problem I had, and your product solved that. Awesome.
Absolutely. So the formula for persuasion is staging, immersion, relevance, target, and then the final piece is action, right? After the message, they need to know that it's urgent that they act upon it.
Exactly. And again, if we look at neurologic immersion data, it's kind of a sine wave. So it's kind of up and down because it's metabolically costly and the brain wants to kind of recover a little bit. You want that call to action to happen at an immersion peak, as you mentioned earlier. But that peak may not be at the end, particularly if you think about storytelling, where I have a narrative arc and I resolve the tension. The peak part of that might be actually at the conflict of the story, and you can actually make the call to action there. So I have looked at neurologic immersion for thousands of ads, Charles, at this point, and so many of them are little story, branding moment, and then call to action. And then by then I've dissipated the immersion. It's too late. So have that branding moment, have that call to action earlier in that conversation. You don't have to finish the entire story. A great example is the movie studios have used our technology a lot. If you look at a movie trailer for listeners, look at a movie trailer, on YouTube or whatever, or the theater, it's half of a narrative arc. Introduce characters, there's a conflict, there's an environment, then something happens, and then what? You got to buy a ticket to find out what happened next. So think about doing sales the same way or any persuasive communication. Hold them, do the call to action when they're most engaged, and then resolve that story with the customer being part of that resolution. So I'll give you another great example of this. If you guys are bored, Tony Robbins gave a TED Talk. He's the only person I know in history that was allowed to go more than 18 minutes on a TED Talk because he gave a talk. When he got to 18 minutes, it was high tension and everyone wanted to know how the story was resolved. And Chris Anderson, the curator of TED, said, this is the one-time exception that we're going to let you go because everyone wants to know how this story resolves. Be that guy, right? Be that great storyteller where I really want to know how I get value out of this story.
Well, and hit them at those peaks of immersion. Talk to me a little bit about your app and how that measures immersion and how we can use that to help with our influence and persuasion abilities.
Right. So we developed an app at getimmersion.com that people can use, anyone can use to measure how immersive a communication is. So you can practice, refine, and get better at it. It's software as a service. And the magic is that we pull brain signals from the peripheral neurologic system using smartwatches and fitness wearables. And so anyone can use it. It's made for regular humans, not weirdo scientists like me, and gives you a chance to develop that test bed so that you can be the most effective communicator.
Well, I've been using it for many months, and it's nice to know when I'm in an immersive experience and when I'm not. You kind of, sometimes it's outside your conscious control. So it's nice to have something that's letting you know in real time how you can change certain things within that experience to hopefully make it more immersive. Or maybe it's a study session, it's a learning session, and you need to take a break, right? Your immersion's going down. Let's take a break. Let's recharge, come back, and hopefully the levels will go up again.
Yeah, exactly right. So again, think of modulating that flow and also fun, right? One of the great takeaways on writing from Stephen King's wonderful little book called On Writing is that it's not the first draft you should be excited about. It's the revisions. The revisions are when it becomes beautiful. So same thing for any persuasive communication. Practice, get feedback any way you can, and craft that to a beautiful little gem that you can then share with the world.
Wonderful. Well, before we end this episode, I always like to get my listeners, is there one key takeaway, one thing that they can start right away in regards to improving their persuasion or influence?
Storytelling, full stop. Be a great storyteller. People will listen. If that story is relevant to the person, they'll listen more. And then don't be afraid to have a call to action, right? So if I'm talking to my kids, my wife, my friends, I want them to do something. I may just want to amuse them, but it's better if I say, here's this amazing thing that I learned about. You should do this thing.
Thank you, Dr. Paul Zak. Really appreciate your time today. Remind our listeners how they can contact you and learn more about your work.
Happy to chat with anyone who's listening at getimmersion.com, immersion with an I.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.